2,000 years ago, a man spoke a few words that would echo across centuries. His name was Jesus of Nazareth, and his message was not merely a religious prophecy, but a psychological revelation. He warned of a moment, a threshold in time, when humanity would cross a line from which there would be no return. Most people read his words as moral instruction or divine prediction, but few understood the deeper truth hidden beneath. Jesus was describing the architecture of the human mind long before psychology was born. Carl Gustav Jung, after a lifetime exploring the human psyche, came to realize that Jesus' teachings mirrored the very patterns he discovered within the collective unconscious. What the ancients called the end of the world, Jung recognized as the disintegration of the old self, the collapse of consciousness when the human ego refuses to evolve. In this light, the apocalyptic language of the scriptures ceases to be about fire and destruction, and instead becomes a map of inner transformation. This warning, however, has been forgotten. Humanity has fallen asleep under the spell of its own progress. We have replaced inner vision with external distraction, sacred meaning with endless consumption. The same patterns that Jung observed in his patients, denial, repression, projection, are now manifesting on a global scale. What was once the private struggle of the individual psyche has become a collective condition, and that is precisely what Jesus foresaw, a time when the shadow of humankind would grow so vast that it could no longer be ignored. Jesus spoke of a time when hearts would grow cold, when love would vanish and darkness would rise not from heaven or hell, but from within us. Jung interpreted this as the inevitable consequence of neglecting the inner world. When people turn away from the soul, they lose connection with what he called the self, the divine center of the psyche. Without that anchor, the ego drifts into chaos, and societies crumble under the weight of their own unconscious forces. It is no coincidence that the age we live in is defined by polarization, anxiety, and loss of meaning. The signs of the coming psychological storm are everywhere: division disguised as identity, progress hollowed by greed, knowledge without wisdom. The unconscious is stirring, rising from its depths to demand recognition. Humanity stands once again before the same mirror that Jesus held up long ago, and most still refuse to look. Jung once said that, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is the very essence of the forgotten warning. Jesus and Jung were pointing toward the same truth, that salvation does not come from outside, but from awakening within. And now, as the collective shadow thickens, their voices converge across the ages to tell us, time is running out. The unconscious has always been alive, but rarely has it been so restless. Beneath the surface of human civilization, something vast is stirring, a silent pressure building within the psyche of our species. Jung called it the collective unconscious, a reservoir of symbols, instincts, and forgotten truths that connects every human being beyond time and culture. And now that deep ocean is rising. When Jesus spoke of tribulation, of chaos and confusion spreading through the world, he was not merely describing political turmoil or natural disasters. He was referring to this same psychic upheaval, the moment when the hidden content of the human mind would burst into collective awareness. Jung saw this too, decades before the modern age, the eruption of unconscious material that would overwhelm societies unprepared to face their own darkness. What religion calls apocalypse is, in psychological language, an eruption of the unconscious. Look around, and you can feel it everywhere. The polarization of nations, the feverish search for enemies, the obsession with identity, power, and control. People no longer see one another. They see projections, mirrors of their own rejected shadows. The world itself has become a therapy room without a therapist, where the collective psyche reenacts its trauma on a global stage. Wars are no longer fought only over land, but over meaning. Truth itself has become fragmented, reflecting the fragmented state of human consciousness. Jung warned that when the unconscious breaks through too violently, it leads to psychosis, not just for individuals but for entire civilizations. We see it in the rise of fanaticism, conspiracy, nihilism, and despair. Each ideology claims to hold the truth, yet each one is a mask, a defense against the unbearable tension of the unknown. Humanity is trying to contain forces that it no longer understands. And yet, this chaos is not meaningless. It is the birth pain of a new consciousness struggling to emerge. What appears as destruction is also revelation. The collective shadow, everything humanity has denied and projected outward, is being forced into view so that it can finally be integrated. But this process is dangerous. When the unconscious surfaces, it does not ask politely to be seen. It tears through illusions and demands transformation. Jesus' words, "What is hidden will be revealed," echo through this moment. He was not describing divine punishment, but psychological necessity. The psyche cannot remain divided forever. Every ignored truth, every unacknowledged wound must eventually find expression. Jung recognized that the same patterns play out in individuals and nations alike. What one person represses becomes neurosis. What humanity represses becomes history. We are perhaps the first generation to witness this awakening on a planetary scale. Technology has woven our minds together, accelerating both knowledge and madness. The boundaries between inner and outer reality blur as dreams, fears, and archetypes flood our collective narrative. And just as Jesus predicted, the line between light and darkness runs not through governments or ideologies, but through every human heart. If Chapter 1 was the call to remember the warning, this is the moment of recognition. The unconscious has awakened, and the mirror cannot be turned away. Humanity stands at the threshold of its own soul, trembling before the depth it once refused to see. There are moments in history when symbols become reality, when the language of prophecy, long dismissed as metaphor, suddenly feels like diagnosis. Both Jesus and Jung foresaw this threshold, though they used different words to describe it. Jesus spoke of the signs of the end. Jung called them the symptoms of a psychic collapse. In truth, they were speaking of the same phenomenon, the disintegration of human consciousness when the inner world is neglected for too long. The first sign is the awakening of the collective shadow. This is the eruption of everything humanity has refused to acknowledge: hatred, fear, envy, the lust for power. Individually, the shadow manifests as guilt and projection. Collectively, it manifests as polarization and war. When Jesus warned that brother would turn against brother, he was describing this psychological contagion, a world possessed by its own repressed darkness. Jung saw it during the World Wars and knew it would return in cycles until we learned to integrate the enemy within. What we refuse to face in ourselves, we are doomed to fight in others. The second sign is the cooling of love, or as Jesus said, the hearts of many will grow cold. In Jungian terms, this is the loss of connection with the self, the divine center of the psyche. Love, in its deepest form, is not sentimentality. It is alignment with that inner source of wholeness. When humanity loses that connection, it becomes spiritually anesthetized. Depression, loneliness, and meaninglessness spread like plagues. The body lives, but the soul withdraws. This is the true spiritual death that Jesus mourned, the disconnection from the inner light that makes us human. The third sign is the inflation of the ego. It is the moment when the human mind, cut off from the self, begins to believe it is godlike. Jesus warned of false prophets and self-declared saviors. Jung interpreted this as the inevitable arrogance of a civilization that worships its own intellect. We see this now in the myth of unlimited progress, our belief that technology can replace wisdom, that we can control nature without consequence, that we can play with creation itself. In psychological terms, this is the ego swollen beyond its limits, and the greater the inflation, the greater the collapse that follows. Every myth teaches this law. What rises without humility must fall into ruin. The fourth and final sign is the emergence of the self, the return of the Son of Man, as Jesus called it. From a psychological perspective, this is not a physical event, but an inner one, the activation of the archetype of wholeness within the collective psyche. When the self arises, it brings light and judgment at once. For those who have done the inner work, it is revelation. For those who have not, it is chaos. The same fire that purifies also consumes. Jung understood that these 4 signs form a cycle, not a punishment. They describe the psyche's attempt to restore balance after long neglect. Humanity is now entering the final stage of that cycle, where everything hidden seeks expression. The question is not whether it will happen, it already is, but whether we will meet it consciously or be destroyed by our refusal to awaken. If the first 3 chapters revealed the diagnosis, this one begins the healing. Both Jesus and Jung understood that awareness without transformation leads to despair. To face the coming storm of the psyche, one must prepare, not through blind faith or intellectual belief, but through deep inner work. The apocalypse, in its truest sense, means revelation, the unveiling of what has always been hidden, and preparation means learning how to endure that unveiling without being torn apart by it. Jung called this process individuation, the journey toward psychological wholeness. Jesus described it as the narrow path that few are willing to walk, the way of inner death and rebirth. Both were describing the same spiritual labor, the descent into one's own darkness to find the divine spark buried within. It is not a doctrine to follow, but a transformation to undergo. The first step is to confront the shadow. This means acknowledging the darkness we carry rather than projecting it onto others. When we hate, judge, or condemn, we are often reacting to something within ourselves that we refuse to see. Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Jesus, too, warned of hypocrisy, of those who see the speck in another's eye while ignoring the beam in their own. The shadow, once faced, loses its power. When we integrate it, we become whole. The second step is to build a conscious relationship with the unconscious. This requires listening to dreams, symbols, and synchronicities, the subtle language of the inner world. Jung discovered that the unconscious speaks in images, not words. Jesus taught in parables for the same reason. The psyche understands through story and symbol. When we pay attention to our inner imagery, we begin to bridge the gap between the visible and the invisible. The third step is the integration of opposites. The human psyche is built upon tension, masculine and feminine, light and shadow, spirit and matter, good and evil. Most people choose one side and reject the other, creating imbalance. Jung called this the tyranny of one-sidedness. Jesus expressed it as loving both neighbor and enemy, recognizing that both are reflections of the same divine totality. True wholeness does not eliminate conflict. It holds it consciously until something greater is born. The final step is the realization of the self, the awakening of the divine center within. This cannot be forced or manufactured. It comes as grace, as a sudden recognition that the light we seek outside has always been inside. Jung described it as the God image within, and Jesus called it the kingdom of God that is within you. This realization does not end the struggle, but it transforms it. The ego ceases to rule and a higher intelligence begins to guide life from within. To prepare, then, is not to escape the chaos, but to become strong enough to face it consciously. It is to anchor oneself in the self before the waves of the collective storm arrive. This is the true vigilance Jesus demanded, to stay awake, to keep the inner lamp burning when darkness covers the world. And as the next chapter reveals, that darkness has already begun to descend, not as punishment but as the labor of a new creation. Every transformation begins with a breakdown. Before light is born, there is the tearing of the sky. Before awakening, there is the collapse of everything familiar. Humanity now stands at that edge. The signs that Jesus once described, and Jung later decoded, are no longer distant symbols. They are living realities unfolding in front of us. What both of them foresaw was not the end of the world, but the end of a world, the death of an era in human consciousness. Jung compared this moment to labor pains. The psyche, like a mother in childbirth, trembles as something new pushes to emerge. Every contraction feels like destruction, but it is not punishment. It is birth. Humanity is undergoing what mystics have always called the night of the soul. The old structures of thought and belief, the systems built upon the ego's illusion of control, are disintegrating. They must. No new life can enter a vessel that refuses to break. Jesus spoke of this as a time of tribulation, but in his words was also a hidden promise. After darkness, there would be light. Jung saw the same pattern in every myth of transformation, the hero's descent into the underworld, the death before resurrection. He knew that when a person or a civilization resists this process, the unconscious forces become destructive, but when accepted consciously, they become redemptive. Pain, then, is not the enemy. It is the midwife of awakening. We see this transformation everywhere, though few recognize it as such. The structures of religion, politics, and identity are cracking because the psyche can no longer sustain lies. The collective ego, inflated by centuries of power and denial, is collapsing under its own weight. The world's confusion, its wars, its moral exhaustion, its growing sense of emptiness, is not meaningless chaos. It is a psychological crucifixion, the stage before renewal. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Jesus lived that truth in flesh. The cross was not only a symbol of sacrifice, but of inner integration, the uniting of opposites, heaven and earth, spirit and matter. Humanity must now pass through that same symbolic cross. The old man, as Jesus called it, must die so that a higher form of being can arise. For some, this transformation will feel like enlightenment, a liberation from the tyranny of the ego, a sudden clarity that life has always been guided by a deeper intelligence. For others, it will feel like madness, the disintegration of all meaning, the terrifying sense that reality itself is falling apart. But both experiences are two sides of the same event. The difference lies only in preparation, in whether one has built an inner center strong enough to withstand the storm. The great transformation is not a distant prophecy. It is happening now within and around us. Every crisis, every collapse, every disillusionment is part of the process. What dies is illusion. What survives is truth. The world is being emptied so that something vast, luminous, and new can take its place. And as Jung and Jesus both knew, what comes after the breaking is not despair. It is revelation. There is a moment in every transformation when the light begins to break through the cracks. The pain does not vanish, but it starts to make sense. This is the threshold, the portal, that both Jesus and Jung described in their own language. For Jesus, it was the narrow gate through which only those who had shed their attachments could pass. For Jung, it was the emergence of the self, the moment when the ego surrenders to a greater center of being. Both paths lead to the same place, the rebirth of consciousness. Jung once dreamed of a radiant doorway suspended in space. Behind it shimmered a realm of pure awareness, but the opening was narrow. Too narrow for anyone carrying their possessions, masks, or fears. To cross it, one had to drop everything that belonged to the old identity. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it." The passage is not physical. It is psychological and spiritual. It requires the death of what we think we are. As the collective transformation intensifies, this portal is opening for humanity as a whole. We are being invited, some would say forced, to release everything false, everything driven by fear, power, or illusion. The closing of the old world is not punishment. It is purification. The structures that once gave us security, our egos, beliefs, systems, are dissolving because they can no longer contain the magnitude of what is being born. Yet this process is not automatic. It demands choice. Every individual must decide whether to cling to the collapsing forms or to surrender and step through the unknown. Those who resist will experience the end as destruction. Those who yield will experience it as awakening. The same fire that burns also illuminates. The same crisis that tears the world apart also reveals the timeless within it. Jung taught that each person who awakens lightens the collective darkness. Jesus said, "You are the light of the world." These truths converge now. Every act of awareness, every moment of compassion, every shadow integrated within oneself contributes to the passage of humanity through the gate. This is not a collective escape, but a collective birth. each soul responsible for carrying its spark across the threshold. But the portal will not remain open forever. Jung's vision ended with the doorway narrowing, closing as those burdened by their attachments tried desperately to enter. This image, both haunting and holy, reminds us that time is not infinite. The call to awaken is not an abstraction, it is immediate. The transformation is already underway, and the only question that remains is whether we will walk through consciously or be dragged through by the force of inevitability. So here we stand, at the dawn of a new consciousness. The warning has been given, the path revealed. What remains is the choice, to cling to the shadows of the old world, or to step naked and unafraid into the light of the self. For once this threshold is crossed, there will be no return. The old era will die, and what awaits beyond is the birth of a world remade in the image of awakening.